Usually on the Backyard History podcast, we cover heroes, we cover good guys, but this time we're going to cover a villain. You see, the Maritimes once spawned an internationally famous hate preacher who sparked riots and violence virtually everywhere he went. Mind you, this wasn't really our fault. He wasn't actually popular in the Maritimes. He was actually chased out of here by angry mobs who once tried to throw him off a mountain. But he escaped though, and he fled to America, and there he became a famous figure, including being an influential, high-ranking figure in the KKK. He toured all over the United States, making himself a vast fortune while spewing a twisted message of hatred, causing violence and riots wherever he went. This is the story of Louis Joseph King, the hate preacher.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
L.J. King always had a talent for self-promotion. He claimed in his autobiography that he had been
born on the Rhine of North America,
which is possibly one of the more unusual nicknames that the St. John/Woolastook River has ever been called. Although he spoke highly of the river, he was less generous in his descriptions of the cities and the people from his home province of New Brunswick. He called St. John
a cordon of despair surrounding a deluded populace,
and meanwhile Fredericton was home to
a proud aristocratic people with no salvation.
As a child, Louis King was raised a Catholic, but he would ultimately build an extremely lucrative career out of stoking hatred towards Catholicism. At the age of only 42 years old, L.J. King published a remarkably poorly written 800-page long autobiography called
The Scarlet Mother on the Tiber, or Trials and Travels of Evangelist L.J. King.
Louis Joseph King had been born in Lower Queensbury, which is about 15 miles away from Fredericton. His father, who was also named Louis Joseph King, was 14 years older than his mother, Madeline Goodine. Where he grew up in Lower Queensbury was close to what we now call the Kingsclear-Woolastook Reserve. The little community was actually pretty diverse back then, and it was evenly split between Irish, French, and Indigenous people. According to King, the three groups generally ignored one another, except for when they went to the same church. He alone, however, somehow managed to unite them in their shared dislike for him. He complained that none of the three groups, who generally kept to themselves, would sit near him in church. The problem with piecing together his life story, though, is that he deliberately lies about much of it for dramatic effect. The most important lie that he repeated was that he had been a Catholic priest when he lived in New Brunswick. He was certainly not. There's all sorts of records that are meticulously tracked and these sort of things, and there's no evidence of that. And also it doesn't even fit into the basic timeline of his life. Nonetheless, the whole basis of his later career in America was his claims that he had spent 5 years in New Brunswick as a Catholic priest and then turned his back on his religion. It seems that his father had actually wanted him to become a priest, but his father died at the age of 53 when King was only 13. While he describes this as a traumatic experience in his autobiography, it doesn't seem to have particularly affected him. But what I mean by this is he does, literally say,
"It was a traumatic experience."
But he doesn't actually say anything other than that. And considering the book is 800 pages long, he had lots of space to get into it. After his father's death, he went on to have a pretty successful life, especially for such a young age. He took his meager inheritance and he moved to Marysville, which is a little village on the outskirts of Fredericton, and he set up a general store. By all accounts, he was a successful businessman and his little shop was profitable. By the age of 18, apparently he was a rousing success with his little store. And then his life changed. The following year, L.J. King went to Maine, where his older brother Lawrence was dying. He stayed with his brother for a week until he passed away. When King returned home, he seemed changed. He wrote about how it affected him in his autobiography. Before I give you this quote, though, I do need to clarify something for you. All of the quotes in this episode are from his autobiography, which King wrote in the third person. So he's writing about himself in the third person, and he calls himself the Reformer in it. So in these quotes, when you hear the Reformer, it's him talking about himself.
The Reformer began to lose sleep and interest in business. Tears flowed freely. He thought folks only cried when people had died. But to cry about your work he could not understand. 2 or 3 handkerchiefs were soaked in tears every night. He was angry at himself. While in bed he screamed in agony and wrapped his head around with a quilt and cried aloud.
Curiously, he didn't draw the connection between his brother's death and the agony he was feeling. But instead, somehow he blamed it all on Catholicism. He focused in on not quite his brother, but something that had happened when he'd earlier visited the same brother in Maine 8 years before. He happened to meet a traveling evangelist preacher, and after a conversation with him, his brother Lawrence had remarked, seemingly as a brief aside,
"It seems you have the right kind of religion."
It's a very confusing origin story, even in his own telling. Evidence, however, points to a very different reason that he didn't join the priesthood, and this was he struggled with celibacy. Actually, he was pretty clear about his own opinion on the matter, saying,
"Celibacy is the hell-twisted cord that holds this together."
At this point, L.J. King seems to be struggling. He sold his little successful shop in Marysville, and he moved to St. John. St. John was the big city at the time. It was actually the 3rd largest city in Canada at this point in time. His activities in the city are extremely difficult to track. He seems to have spent 3 years in St. John, and they are very formative years in his life, but he glosses over what happened here in his autobiography. This is pretty frustrating because it actually seems to have been at this point where he perfected this preaching style that would later make him rich and famous, and it went on to influence a particular type of American preacher, even to this day. It actually seems that he radicalized himself. It doesn't seem there were any outside influences in St. John that made him this extremist. But nonetheless, he became increasingly known as a hateful and aggressive preacher in this time. Also, he may have murdered his fiancée in a mysterious 1898 midnight skating incident. Her name was Sybil Jones, and he complained in his book that he wrote that he was accused by police of having been involved in her murder. Now, this was weird because I couldn't actually find any kind of police reports or newspaper reports that said that he was actually accused of this. And in fact, police and newspapers didn't ever say that it was anything other than a tragic accident. Nonetheless, in his book, he recounted the following remarkably dramatic and weirdly superstition-laden tale, seemingly blaming the death of his fiancée on a mysterious, slow-witted man. Who, by the way, there's no evidence that this other mysterious man existed. It was just the 2 of them doing this. So here's that strange quote.
"We must now go back to the year 1898 to complete the link of that strange history. In the winter, while skating was good, my fiancée determined to skate to the post office to mail a letter 4 miles away. It was the night of an eclipse of the moon, and for some reason her folks did not care to have her go. As she started from the house, she was seized with a kind of nervous chill, returned for warmer wraps, and again started. A little further on, a large black cat jumped out and frightened her back to the house, and, upon relating the same, was entreated not to go out that night. But she persisted. While en route to the village, she was joined by a half-witted fellow whose company she resisted, but together they skated up the river. Some distance up, a group of skaters thought they heard a noise as if someone was drowning, but dismissed the thought. Slayers passing by the opposite side thought they heard the sound, and someone called, "Is all well?" "Yes," came the reply. The man arrived back at the village wet, with one skate lost and the lapel of his coat torn. When questioned, he said he had fallen into the river and finally said, "Miss Jones is drowned." Foul play was suspected. In the spring, after the ice had broken up after a thunderstorm, her body was found lying near her home, near the shore, with the engagement ring still on her hand. The whole affair was shrouded in mystery.
Despite all of that theatrical story, he doesn't seem to have been remotely upset by the death of his first fiancée under mysterious circumstances. And what do I mean by that? Well, in quite literally the next line in his book, King writes,
"While holding meetings at St. John, the reformer met Miss Nellie Toole, which resulted in marriage on October 31st, 1899.
During this quick wedding, we can already see him demonstrating what would become the key part of his life: money-making. According to the St. John Daily Telegraph newspaper, he charged guests at his wedding a 10-cent admission fee to attend. But the newspaper noted that,
as the crowd began to enter the hall in goodly numbers, the admission fee was raised to 15 cents and later to 20 cents.
King claimed that in St. John he would preach in open-air services on the bluff by Fort Howe, which is a kind of mountain on the outskirts of the city back then that was marked by some sharp cliffs. He claimed that thousands of St. Johners would attend his sermons. Other contemporary reports suggest that it was more like a couple dozen people at most. King claims that a mob of furious St. Johners tried to throw him off of a 200-foot-high cliff on Mount Howe. In his telling of things, he was just sweetly and innocently holding an outdoor sermon for his followers when he was attacked, unprovoked, by an angry mob. In his telling, of course, he did nothing wrong, and the mob came out of nowhere, and they attacked him, and they tried to kill him for no reason. What his version of events admits, but fails to explain, however, is why his innocent flock of followers were heavily armed at the time. St. John newspapers recount a very different version of events. They claim that King led an angry mob of Protestant hardliners, which were called Orangemen, through the streets of a distinctly run-down working-class part of St. John to attack a Catholic gathering. A rival angry mob formed as they were going down the streets, and this counter-mob was not just Catholics, but it managed to unite other religions against him as well to defend the Catholics and attack L.J. King and his followers. King described these events in his autobiography, and by the way, he's still speaking in the third person.
He had been warned of the intended attempt on his life.
He had assembled his followers on that large hill where Fort Howe National Historic Site is now located. They were gathering to attack the Catholics, which, by the way, he freely admitted to, writing,
"The Orangemen had come prepared with revolvers, clubs, etc."
By all accounts, the mob attacked them before they were ready, with the goal of throwing King off the side of Mount Howe, or as he dramatically phrased it,
"They made an attempt to throw the reformer off the precipice."
Rather than an intimidating march through the streets towards the Catholic gathering, instead King and his followers had to race down the roads while being attacked to try and get to the safety of the Orangeman Lodge that was their base.
Blood flowed freely, bones were broken, and bottles hurled, but after a hard fight, the police and Orangemen succeeded in dragging the reformer away from the crowd and into the street.
St. Johners poured out of their homes to attack him in the streets as he was rushed to the safety by the police. King claimed.
Water and missiles were thrown from overhead windows, and yells of kill him, followed him by the bloodthirsty mob.
King was hidden in the local Orange Lodge, which was defended by police from the angry mob trying to get at him. While several rioters were arrested, they were all released without charges. King would soon after leave St. John, and he would never preach there again. This was L.J. King's first riot, and it would certainly not be his last. In fact, it became his signature calling card. After being chased out of St. John, King scurried off to Nova Scotia. There he perfected what he would later do to make his fame and fortune. He would go to a particular town or city, he would rent a hall, and he would set up there for a couple of weeks, a few weeks actually, probably like 6 or 7 weeks per place. He would preach particularly hateful sermons, he would divide the town in an effort to convert the followers to what he considered his version of Protestantism. Usually after a few weeks of this, locals would get fed up with his hate and division, and they would form an angry mob and attack him. And then he would go and complain to the media for sympathy, and then he would make money out of it, and then he would leave town and he'd set up in a new place and he'd do it all again. King's final Nova Scotian riot, the last one before he was finally chased out of Canada for good, was in Advocate Harbour. As perhaps a sign of how wildly detested he had the unique ability to make himself, this time he was targeted by members of his own sect, Protestants.
The reformers' persecutions began by backsliding Protestants who had united against the meeting, backed by wire-pulling politicians known as liberals who always leaned towards rum. Hell united their forces to drive us out of town.
Actually, King managed to do a remarkable job of uniting everyone in the little town against him.
About 50 men, mostly drunk, came and stoned the building and drove us out.
They included politicians, police, Baptists, Catholics, Protestants, even Orangemen, all uniting to drive him out. And that was the last time King ever set foot in Nova Scotia. But of course he wasn't running away, at least according to him. According to King's telling of things, his daughter, who has the remarkable name of Willow Vinetta King, fell out of a hammock and injured her back. And so they went to the United States to get medical treatment. In the United States, L.J. King went directly to St. Louis. He's at this point just a much hated weirdo from the Maritimes, and within days of arriving at St. Louis, has an explosion of extreme popularity in the United States from pretty much the moment he arrives. And this instantly propelled him to the seemingly immediate American fame and fortune. And all of this happened pretty much immediately after getting into St. Louis. See, he just got to St. Louis and he was just walking down the street past a Catholic school. Completely out of the blue, on a total whim, with absolutely no provocation whatsoever, he storms right up into the school, in the middle of a school assembly that's going on inside. He charges right onto the stage and he shouts at the school children,
"God is dead and the priests took his place."
And a priest punched him in the face. Now, priests back then would usually wear heavy rings, and if you get a cut on your forehead, it tends to bleed an awful lot, but not in a life-threatening way. That is exactly what happened. The priest punched King, and he was wearing a heavy ring, and it left a bloody but harmless cut on King's forehead. And then the priest chased King out of the school. And then, with blood running down his face and soaking into his white shirt, King went directly to the St. Louis Advocate newspaper and told them he had been the victim of a Catholic attack. In an act of defiance for this attack, he called for an anti-Catholic rally in the center of a heavily Catholic part of St. Louis. Predictably enough, the rally turned into a riot, and during it, King ran away, and he hid in a furniture store as the violence which he caused raged around him. King again complained to the media he was innocent and was being attacked. And so, less than 1 week after his arrival in the country, he had skyrocketed to a national level of fame in his brand new adopted country of the United States. The United States always had a paranoid streak running through a particular section of its population. If you're interested in reading more about that, I highly recommend checking out a famous and influential 1964 essay called The Paranoid Style in American Politics by Richard Hofstadter, but I'm not going to go into any more details on that. In King's time, though, the big conspiracy theory of the day was that the government was being secretly run by Catholics who were following the direct orders from the Pope in Rome to do some kind of ill-defined but vague and menacing things that threaten real America. Now, this is already pretty convenient for King because he already had a dislike of Catholics. But he suddenly realized that he could make lots and lots of money from this if he created a great big spectacle. Which means to say, if he made it into a big show. He was already an entertaining showman. He was known for his flowery sermons. But now, he really ramped up the entertainment value. For example, when he was preaching a sermon, he made frequent costume changes. He would include skits in his sermons, in which he would do things like dress up like Catholic priests. He also brought out props, which he claimed were torture devices used in nunneries and churches by Catholics. And, perhaps most importantly, he realized that that paranoid strain of American politics, which, by the way, is still there, had a strong undercurrent of sex in it. It doesn't really matter who the conspirator was or which conspiracy was popular, there was always some kind of deviant secret sexual practice that they were into. And the people who were really into these conspiracies walked this strange line where they detested whatever the deviant sexual practice was, but were perhaps also a little too interested in it. And King was the master of this. I found several quotes that called his sermons full-blown pornographic, and they would also involve titillating his audiences with lurid tales of seduction in confession booths and things like that. For example, just one example of this, he wrote a 7-page long poem, which he read out during these things, called The Priest and the Woman, which was about a seduction in a confession booth. And then, being a great businessman, when he realized audiences reacted well to it, he expanded that poem into a 296-page long book. His big hit, though, was a signature speech called
The Black Nunnery.
And he toured all over America talking about it. And he made vast sums of money with his public speaking. And he also had side projects too. He would have a mail order pamphlet business. He'd have all these books. But his biggest prop to bring these stories to life was a succession of ever-changing women that he would bring out on stage with him who claimed to be
escaped nuns.
Basically, these women were another prop. The most famous of these women was a quote-unquote escaped nun named Helen Jackson from Montreal, who would deliver a speech called Convent Cruelties to audience members who paid a whopping 50 cents, which was a lot of money back then. She claimed to have been a nun in Montreal and described
Bacchic orgies, harems for the priesthood, murdered babies.
Eventually, the American media got around to fact-checking Helen Jackson. Turns out that her name was actually Helen Barnowski, and she was from Pennsylvania. She'd never been a nun, and she'd never actually even visited Montreal, let alone lived there. She'd actually been a prostitute, which is where she met King. Helen Barnowski responded to these allegations by the American media by suing the newspaper who fact-checked her. However, she didn't sue for libel, and she didn't even deny these allegations or try and defend herself, in an astonishing twist, she sued them for loss of income. In the ensuing trial, which she lost, her own mother, who was a poor and by all accounts extremely confused by what was happening Polish immigrant who hadn't heard from her daughter in years, testified Helen had never been entirely the same since she'd stabbed herself in the head with a pencil when she was a little girl. In the 1920s, King fell in with the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, he strongly promoted the KKK. He personally wrote the infamous pamphlet titled,
Why We Need the KKK.
At the time, the KKK was a ferociously anti-immigrant group, making King's closeness with them really ironic, since he was actually an illegal immigrant. He never even bothered to apply for American citizenship, and actually, for his whole life, he continued living in the United States and was an illegal immigrant the whole time. So to give you just one example of how these riotous rallies went, I'm just gonna pick one random riot that L.J. King and Helen Jackson / Barnowski did. This isn't a special riot, this isn't their biggest, it's not their smallest, it's not their worst riot, it's not their best riot, this is just a day in the life of L.J. King and Helen Jackson. This one takes place in South Bend, Indiana, on the Sunday night of October 19th, 1924, at the Cadle Tabernacle Church in front of an audience of, according to the Annapolis News, 3,000 people. The church effectively acted as a base for the local KKK. Their show, and it was definitely a show, opened just like a concert would, with Helen Jackson as the warm-up act. The theme of her show that day was how nuns would be buried alive by misbehaving. And maybe I didn't stress this enough, but all of these allegations against Catholics are entirely made up. These aren't true. They just straight up made these up so they can make a lot of money, just to clarify. I want to make that super clear. So as Helen Jackson spoke, L.J. King was circulating the crowd, and he was loudly demanding donations from the attendees. Next came the headlining act. Louis Joseph King took the stage. He was in fine form that night. He was ranting and he was railing against all these made-up issues with Catholics. He was startlingly insulting, just for the sake of being insulting. He called the Eucharist
The water of Christ.
And he mocked the Trinity by saying,
If Mary was the mother of God, who then is the grandmother of God?
Yeah, I don't really get it yet, but apparently the crowd went wild for it. As he spoke, Helen Jackson in turn circulated the crowd, and then this time it was her loudly demanding donations from attendees. Suddenly, one remarkably brave Catholic woman in the crowd, named Helen Collier, approached the podium and interrupted King's rant, arguing with him in front of 3,000 angry spectators about his statements. King threw a glass of water in her face, and he ordered the men in the audience to throw her out. And so Helen Collier was dragged out of the church, and then she went to the police. And like I said before, King would spend several weeks in each town to get people all worked up. So he'd been in South Bend for several weeks, and the police were pretty fed up with him. 24 police officers came to Cadle Tabernacle Church to break up the rally. The police were actually accompanied by Howard Cadle, who spotted an opportunity to get his church back. Before King came to town, Howard Cadle, who was a politician, had been considered a radical anti-Catholic, and that's why he let King use his church. But even he, who had been considered pretty radical, was shocked at how aggressive King and the KKK were. And then he in turn shifted his political views, and he wanted his church back. The police were also led by Helen Collier, and she was the one who had a glass of water thrown in her face by King, and remarkably enough, she returned to the church to kick King out. The police quickly shut down King's rally, and they drove the crowd outside. Undeterred, King continued his sermon on the steps. He whipped up the crowd into a frenzy with his violent rhetoric, and he ordered them to smash their way through the church front doors to get back in, which the crowd did. Once inside, he took to the podium and he demanded that
every red-blooded American in this crowd must resist the reformers' arrest.
As the crowd surged forward to attack the police, L.J. King and Helen Jackson slipped out the side door and escaped unscathed into the night. These events weren't even a blip in the career of L.J. King. They weren't significant enough for him to bother mentioning in his book. That was just another night. But actually that one's interesting because there were wide repercussions for the state that he and Helen Jackson just slipped away with, leaving in a riot. The events that he set in motion convinced the Annapolis News newspaper to launch a full investigation of the KKK, of its attacks, and focused on unmasking and outing its members. Not only did this newspaper ultimately successfully break the KKK in the area, but they also even won a Pulitzer Prize for their efforts. As for King himself, though, he continued his career without repercussions. One Arizona newspaper famously labeled him
the traveling peacebreaker.
Now, if you're hoping for some kind of cosmic karma or some kind of celestial consequences for his actions, well, that's not always how life works. In fact, Louis Joseph King got the happy ending that any Hollywood movie would want. He got large sums of money, power, wealth. He built a large mansion in Toledo, and it wouldn't be a fairy tale ending if he didn't get the girl in the end. Now would it? Well, that happened too. Years later, he tracked down his one-time assistant, Helen Jackson / Barnowski. She was the fake nun. After losing her libel suit and being discredited, Helen Jackson / Barnowski had disappeared. She changed her name, she changed her identity, and she changed her way of life. She settled down, she got married, she had kids, she lived a quiet, obscure, and apparently happy life. And then L.J. King suddenly appeared in her life and swept Helen off her feet. She abandoned her husband and kids to go move to King's mansion. And it seems that this duo, who'd sown hatred and division and pain and conflict, suffering and violence all over the continent, settled down and lived happily ever after.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.